Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is Michel Akkad with my co-host Anish Koka, and this is episode 19 of the Akkad and Koka report. You will be able to find the show notes for this episode at akkadandkoka.com/episode 19. We are delighted to have as our guest today Dr. Brahmaji Nalamotu, who is professor of medicine at the University of Michigan. Dr. Nalamotu is an interventional cardiologist who obtained his MD degree from Wayne State University and completed his training at the University of Michigan. He's an accomplished scientist whose research interests focus on coronary disease and its treatment with angioplasty and stenting, with a particular emphasis on outcomes research. Dr. Nalamotu is editor-in-chief of the medical journal Circulation, Cardiovascular Quality and Outcomes, and he has kindly agreed to join us to chat about current controversies in the areas of research publishing, peer review, and the role of journals in the dissemination of scientific knowledge. Dr. Nalamotu, or Brahmaji, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I thought I would start the conversation just if you could orient us a little bit to the business side of medical publishing, because I don't think most doctors, and perhaps maybe even many academics, understand fully the relationship between the publishing companies that tend to be vilified, like, they're being greedy, Elsevier, they're refusing to make the articles accessible. And then I guess they would be called the sponsoring organizations, like the American Heart Association, which is the sponsor, I don't know if you would call it the publisher of your journal, and then the editorial board, and how does all that work? Can you give us a little, sort of broad overview of all this?
Sure. So for every journal, it varies and it can be different. So as you said, for our journal, we're one of the journals of the American Heart Association kind of family of journals. Circulation is kind of the, probably it definitely is the leading journal within that kind of group, headed by Joe Hill. But, the American Heart Association is not a publisher, right? I mean, they can't kind of produce a journal, kind of host it on a website and things like that. And so they've contracted out to, an organization that'll do that. And every so often they do actually change, the organization that works with them for doing that. So, it can be different. There's other types of organizations that work differently. So, for example, the BMJ is published by a group that actually is the publisher of the journal, not only the BMJ, but all the sister journals that go along with it. There is a lot of, focus on this, and I think it's an important topic because I think, one of the things that comes up oftentimes in discussion is the idea of editorial independence. How our journal interacts with the American Heart Association, which might interact with the publisher. I can't speak for every journal, but I can tell you from our perspective and stuff, and we can get into it, but, earlier in the year, we published a fairly controversial manuscript by Daryl Francis and his group. And I have to say, I was quite proud of how the American Heart Association, as well as the editor, Joe Hill in Circulation, and kind of all the folks involved really handled it. They were very kind and supportive. They might not have agreed with all the decisions I made, but they did agree that it was kind of our team's decision to make, and then further how we kind of handled the response to that. So I think it's super important that kind of independence be maintained, because one of the things that is definitely true about this is a subjective art. And I'll be completely honest with you. It's interesting to me, the further I get along, you see, there's a mix of papers that come in front of you, a mix of topics, and to be honest and stuff, maybe about half are fairly easy to make a decision about. They're just not the right fit. They're not at the tier or quality we have, but you also have some maybe 10, 15% of papers that you're really excited about, and you think that this is going to be a great fit. This is exactly what we want to do. But it's remarkable to me how much subjectivity there can be in between. And so maintaining that independence from these other organizations is really important. And especially as you allude to, I was just going to say, this is a big business, especially for some of the top journals that are out there.
So just to clarify, the publishing company, if the American Heart Association has a contract with the publishing company to publish the paper journal and also have the web, the website and so forth, what does the publishing company have a say as to what how do they handle the content? Do they have a say in the content at all, or just they have a say in where the content gets pushed in terms of or sold? I mean, do they they make money from sending the journals to libraries across the world and subscription and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, some people have talked a little bit in the past, and it's not just with one company, but a lot of these practices about bundling some of the subscriptions, right? So, there might be a journal like for Elsevier, for example, the Lancet is a big draw, right? And it might be hard for a library to get access to the Lancet alone, but they get the Lancet along with a dozen other titles that probably nobody in their institution really cares about. And so it does certainly play a role in terms of how the journal is made available. And in particular with, pay firewalls and stuff, it can be a big issue. I'd say from my perspective, I mean, journals are very much, they're very much a pyramid, right? I mean, we all know, unfortunately, I mean, I'll be honest with you, CERC CQO is not at the top of that pyramid. There are other journals. Thankfully, we're not at the bottom of the pyramid either. And I think for me, the publishers for a day-to-day kind of aspect, what's really interesting is they play a role in how my journal can express itself, particularly in an online format. So I'll give you one example. We recently started a visual abstract series. And, we kind of talked with the journal publisher. We talked with the American Heart Association. We wanted to start these. This was about over a year ago. And getting the online format kind of set up so that we could actually, place these visual abstracts, place them in a place where, individuals who are at the paper will actually be able to see it and being able to disseminate it. It took a little bit of work, but actually the American Heart Association was very supportive of that. Now, when the New England Journal went into like the visual abstract area, I mean, they can move like heaven and earth, right? I mean, they are a very influential and powerful group, and they do it really, oftentimes in like kind of just a really remarkable way.
And they're self-contained. It's just one organization that does the publishing and everything, or?
Right. I mean, well, they're owned by the Massachusetts Medical Society, right? So
right.
You'd see that they're their owners. But yeah, that's exactly true. So similar to like the BMJ group as well.
Okay. But now, so how does the American Heart Association make money out of medical journals? Or does it all go to pay the publishing company, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, I have to be honest and stuff. I've never seen the internal books for any of these things.
Okay.
I imagine that everyone probably takes a little bit of their cut in this, and I'm sure you've seen, just like I've seen, some of the headlines on how much these companies actually make. And when you think about the whole business model, and I'll say this very openly, right? I mean, I'm an editor, I'm part of it, but it really is it's a tough situation, right? I mean, you've got an author, a team of scientists, they go out and hustle, they get a grant, right? They do all this work, right? They spend years on this, and then they ask the journal to publish it. And if the journal chooses to, they immediately just kind of waive all rights to their material.
Right.
And it just, I mean, if someone tried to describe this in a business model, it just wouldn't make sense. But
yes, yeah, I imagine. Sure, and we'll get into this a little bit more. But just here, you were talking about sort of editorial independence. Do you feel that the people above you, or either at the AHA or the publishers, are they concerned about material that you publish at a business level because of what it does to readership, or is it primarily a reputation, or their view of where the content of the journal should be on a purely scientific basis, or what pressures do you get as an editor?
Again, I'm just saying this very openly. I have not gotten any, and I mean, I imagine that there probably could be a situation where it potentially comes up, but I personally have never. I'm trying to think. I mean, like any other kind of employee, I get annually reviewed. it's remarkable, like how much the review is based on, I mean, you both write a lot about this, but it's everybody's got performance measures, it turns out, even editors. And
even the editor of the Journal of Performance Measures. Right.
Yeah. So it's, and many of them are, they make about as much sense as some of
the irony.
So, but yeah, no, for an individual article, never have had a situation. And like I said, I mean, I tend to be very, I like to talk through when there are issues that have come up. And we published, like I said, a couple of controversial things. And most of the time I will, get on the phone. I have a group of some senior editors who, senior consultants who I've oftentimes asked about very controversial pieces. Because it's remarkable, oftentimes people will say things and, yeah, I don't know, like, there's a tone, when you see something that's on social media, and then there's a tone in journals. And maybe that tone, sometimes I debate it myself. Maybe it actually makes the point even more boring or not as interesting. I worry about that. But at the same time, it's amazing. I think people expect a type of different discourse in the journals. And so we've tried to balance that out, but they've given me a lot of independence, and so I've really appreciated that.
And I thought you've done very well. I mean, those editorials, I've read them in preparing for the show. They're engaging. They're accessible, I think, for the regular physician or practitioner. Not just the academic. But at the end of the day,
one quick question, Michelle. You've picked my interest in this performance review thing, because you know how much I love performance metrics. What? So how exactly? So what metrics do they use to hold your feet to the fire, if you're allowed to say? What's on this performance review for editors?
Yeah. So a lot of it is around. So I'll tell you, it is one thing where we as editors oftentimes get to kind of contribute to like what we want to be measured on, right? So some of them is like the blocking and tackling of journal, editorial work, which is like, okay, how do papers come in? How many get initially reviewed and rejected? How many go out for peer review? What's the timeline? I mean, if people are frustrated with door to balloon time, time from paper submission to like initial decision, I mean, it's something that we oftentimes get held to a lot. And it's like anything, right? I mean, there's a ceiling, and I think we've quickly reached that ceiling, but we keep promising we're going to go lower and lower and lower. In fact, one of my famous pieces is like this satirical post in the BMJ from years ago, where there was an argument for like slow tracking publications, right? It's just like, I love that piece, and I quote it all the time to our team, because it's just one of these things where you go out, you do all this work for years, literally, right? And then you want people to decide in like 4 weeks whether or not they're going to take it or not take it. But that tends to be a huge focus for us. The other metrics that are interesting are now alt metrics, social media reach and things like that are playing a bigger and bigger role. And then, I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't say the risk standardized mortality rate of journal publications is obviously the impact factor.
Right. So at the end of the day, does it remain the sort of the metric by which you live or die as an editor?
I think
it fluctuates. It probably doesn't change very rapidly, right? I mean, it's not going to immediately drop to the floor, from one issue to the next, right? It's something that I imagine. I'm not familiar with the how it's actually calculated.
Yeah, it's like a lot of things. I mean, it's probably very similar to like, there's a component of it that's probably around reputation, but it's definitely, so the way that it's constructed is it takes all the original articles in your journal. So in 2017, if you want the 2017 impact factor, you would take all the citations for the original articles that were published the 2 years prior, and how many times those were cited in 2017. And so the denominator is super important in the impact factor, like what's considered an original article. And there's been a lot of critiques around this, right? If you look at the content of some of our major journals now, there's fewer and fewer original articles. More and more editorial material, solicited material, perspectives and viewpoints. Those don't count. But they can count in the numerator, because if they're cited, they'll count for your impact factor. It's
Right.
just that they don't count in the denominator. So there's all sorts of questions about gaming. And in fact, you're talking, it's funny because, impact factor, there is a fluctuation at certain points. Like if you have a big paper that tends to get cited a lot, it's like, let's say a methods paper, and for 2 years it gets cited like crazy. In journals that are smaller and publish lower numbers of papers, that can have a huge paper impact. And so, it's one of the ways in which people have kind of considered why it's not like the ideal measure. And then the other thing too is like, you guys talk about this all the time on social media, but like, how important is a paper in terms of the measure of just being cited a lot? And that's a question that, is certainly valid as well.
All right. Speaking of which, let me throw a tweet at you, written by Jeff Flyer, the former dean of Harvard, a few weeks ago, and he says, "Communicating science doesn't require that a paper be reviewed and accepted anymore," and that's in reference to the bioRxiv preprint website. So, for the audience, it means that more and more papers now are published on websites ahead of publication, formally in a journal. And somebody was making a comment on Twitter that their paper had been viewed, thousands of times, and this is the comment that Jeff Flower made in response to that. Now, he mentions the bioRxiv, which is really for basic science. For medical science, it seems that the adoption of a similar preprint process has been slower. What's your perspective on that? What's your take?
Yeah, no, it certainly has been the case. So the American Heart Association and CIRC-CQO's policy is that we will accept preprints. Now, there are some journals who don't accept preprints. The idea is that they consider that previously published material, and they want unpreviously published material to kind of consider. I think that, sometimes the rationale behind that, they can justify it in lots of different ways. But, when we've kind of thought about this, and it's not a slam dunk idea. I mean, I can understand both points of views, but I do think that the things that are in favor of preprints, getting material out there early. I mean, we all know this. Anybody who's been an author on a paper, I mean, sometimes it can take you 2 years to go through the process, right? From the journal you start with to like how you eventually end up. And the fact that you can get the material out there is attractive. I think that, the concern has been in the health sciences that if you put a preprint on in like a lab science idea, that it's immediately not going to be like utilized by practitioners, right? So if you suddenly say drug A is better than drug B and you post it on a preprint, the concern is that, suddenly practitioners are going to see that preprint and start doing, what that conclusion might entail. I think it's challenging to get people to use things that even work and have been shown to be repeatedly established. So I'm not sure if that's an immediate changer.
I agree.
I also think it ignores the fact that I think practitioners are pretty sophisticated enough to know the difference between a preprint and a publication and something that's been discussed and vetted a bit. And conference abstracts are a great example of that, right? I mean, conference abstracts, we don't just suddenly, something gets presented at AHA and the next thing you know, that's very rare that, the entire American medicine practice changes. So I think that there's good things about getting it out there and getting that material there soon. It does really beg, what is the value then of getting it through the system? And I'm not sure if this is a question that you guys find compelling, but I think a lot about it is like, the difference between preprint and then a publication is the editorial process, and in particular, the magic that we oftentimes entail with peer review. And that's a real...
Right. Now, I mean, anybody with a website, anybody, it costs pennies to publish if you're a scientist and you're a researcher, it really costs very little to have your data and your paper online for everyone to see. And so at the end of the day, isn't publishing does it become, is the main social role of publishing to help scientists with for their academic advancements, as opposed to really, advance or disseminate scientific knowledge to the community at large, especially if it takes 2 years, or I don't know what the average is, but it takes a long time for the material to get through the process. And also, I think among scientists, for whom it matters, the colleagues who are in the particular niche or field will know about the data. Early on, the data will be presented at meetings and so forth. And so, what's the current value? Real value, in your opinion, about getting a paper published in a journal?
Yeah, no, I think that there's certainly, like you said, culturally, getting a paper in the New England Journal or like Science or Nature, it can make or break careers. So there's a real value that we've kind of established with that. And that's really important to really acknowledge. I think besides those types of like value, because I think that there's probably other ways we can measure science. And remember, just because you got a paper into a very high impact factor journal, right, or a very influential journal, even those journals publish bad papers, right? And then there's like these jewels that are sometimes published in like much lower journals. So the average of that journal doesn't necessarily correlate with the individual articles that appear in them. I think still to this day, and this is an argument that people are on different sides of, but the real value to journals is that, and it's hard because we live in this day and age where like information is like so easily accessible, but it's almost like we live in a world of like too much information. I tell people like, man, if you saw all the papers that come across, look, I'm just like one tiny journal in like this sea of even journals. And if you see even all the papers that come across my desk, that I have to think about, or, my deputy editor, Mike Coe, is the other person that filters these as well. To get down to like the 80 articles we publish a year and we think are important enough, that's hard enough to think about those, right? You can't even remember the articles that come through, and we have too many that are out there. And somehow I think there's a value in having a group of editors like those at JAMA or those at the New England Journal, those at Circulation, who say, this is kind of what we think is important. And I know that rubs people the wrong way because, it kind of like builds at the idea that there are these gatekeepers to information. So I think, have preprints, have them out there, have them be, available. But I'll tell you, most of the time, and I've only had a couple of friends who've ever even posted a preprint, and I'm always asking them, what was the experience like? And they're like, I wish there was an experience to describe, right? They'll go to the site and they can't even find that anyone's actually even looked at it.
Right.
Right. So
yeah, so you're absolutely right, and I think that's correct. There's a torrent, an avalanche of publications,
right?
And in a way, I was reflecting on that a couple of years ago, and I thought, a lot of it I think has to do with, people complain about the funding of science, but there's actually massive funding of science, and the people who fund science don't really know and are not really held accountable by whether the publication has any merit or the the dollars being spent have any merit.
Mm-hmm.
But so there's the floodgates are open. People are encouraged to get into PhDs, to publish and publish and publish, and it's exceedingly difficult for the for even scientists, let alone the public, to sort of sort out. So I think I agree with you that there's this role for medical journals to serve as gatekeepers, because otherwise it's completely overwhelming.
Oh, it absolutely is. So whether or not this filter value is something that different people kind of consider, like I said, I think we can have a hybrid model where we still have these journals, where there's good quality, at least I feel like a value brought through the peer review process, and some kind of, I'll tell you, different publishers what one thing that they do bring a value to, and it varies, but if any of you have ever worked on like, if you've had a paper accepted, I mean, some of these publishing houses are remarkable. I mean, the New England Journal and the BMJ and JAMA, I mean, they will take your paper and they will fine tune it. They'll really work with you on the tables. They'll redraw figures for you. So there is some modest value to that stuff as well too. And that can make a big difference. But yeah, I think it's a really important role of the journals to kind of, Saurabh Jha at Rograd has a great quote, which I oftentimes use too. I've borrowed it quite a bit, but he writes, he once wrote like, the duty of journals, or the job of journals, is to tell us, what to think about, not what to think. And I think that that's a really important insight, which is like, because I can tell you, when you see a paper and you're like, wow, that's a great idea. That's like a really cool idea. I don't know if they're correct, right? Those are the hardest papers to judge for us, because, do we have to establish that it's perfectly, absolutely true or not? I don't know. I struggle with that a little bit, because if it's really interesting and it seems like it's a good step forward, I want to start the conversation and discussion oftentimes. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. And on that note, what, rejecting papers on the basis of a p-value that's not met and so forth, or does that keep you up at night, or, is your conscience bothered? Or do you even get any, you probably don't get any papers who, that are not already pre-filtered by having reached statistical significance and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's part of the big problem, right? Is that like we don't see all the stuff in the file drawer, so we think everything works, right? Yeah, I think look, if CircCQO was the only journal in the world, I'd probably lose sleep with every rejection. But the reality is like I tell people, like, actually one of our very first early editorial board meetings, like I was up on call that night with like a really sick patient, right? And I go home, I sleep for a few hours, and then I have this editorial board meeting. And it was probably the best meeting I've ever run, because I was thinking the clearest. And I was just like, look, if we've already talked about this for this long and we're struggling with this, let's just move on. And sometimes we spend a lot of time talking about things, but I think we know in our gut, like, whether we're going to move ahead or not. Very early on in my tenure, I tried to like predict, I'd see the papers that came through and I'd say, okay, are we going to eventually take this or not? And I just keep like a little, sheet just to see how well I do. And at that time, we weren't really calibrated very well as a group. But I think increasingly, I kind of get a sense that like I can kind of see if a paper is going to make it or not. There's about 10 to 15% that I probably am like on the margins around. But that's both a good and a bad thing. I think one thing that's good about it is it shows that we're getting well calibrated as a group. But the bad thing is, maybe we're becoming too well calibrated as a group, and we're not, sometimes you worry about being too insular and not thinking about different ideas. Anish had a great, there was a paper, and I'm forgetting the details, but it was something that it was pushing back against the idea that like maybe, modest kind of payments or something like that. You'll remember, Anish, like it was like modest payments in physician offices had no effect on patterns of like prescription use or something. And I think you wrote something like, how come this never shows up in general journals and it's got to be on a healthcare blog? And I thought a lot about that. And I was like, if that thing came through our journal, like, would we be open enough to say, okay, look, they've got good data. How can we vet this? Is it a worthwhile message? Is it sharing something that's useful? Because we all have our own kind of idea of how the world works and the framework in which we live in. And we just have to protect ourselves against that occasionally.
Right. So, that's funny you brought that up. I was actually just going to follow up and ask you about, the idea, as you're bringing up, is that should exist, is that these journals exist to be playgrounds in terms of, information that's out there, and you kind of, toss around that ball and you figure it out by having a conversation. But do you feel like some of the larger, high impact journals have a large amount of editorializing in terms of crossing that border from, hey, these are all the sides, and what do you guys think about this, versus this is how we kind of want to shape the conversation. It's a leading question because my bias is that, so I'll lay it out there for anyone who's listening. My bias is that some of the major journals have a clear desire to shape that conversation, whether it be JAMA or BMJ or even the New England Journal, and especially when it comes to policy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think I feel like I love the job I have because I think at CircCQO I have the ability to be a bit more independent, a bit more risky about what we publish. I mean, I don't know what it would be like. I mean, Jeff Drazen has a hard job, right? Anything that shows up in that journal, I mean, we all talk about, right, that week. And so him and his team, I think they've done a great job. I mean, they have a really tough job. And I mean, so do, Richard Horton in the Lancet and everyone that's out there in these big journals. So, they probably have their own culture. We have our own culture where it's formed by who we are. One of the things I realized, it's an off story, but like when I was trying to construct my editorial board, right? I mean, I was working with my and we're writing down people. And I remember the insight I had was I was like, damn, I know way too many Indian cardiologists who are interventionalists, right? I mean, like, I'm like, we can't have like this just be a mirror of myself. And so, going around trying to find people who thought differently. I mean, one of the reasons I followed both of you guys is I really don't agree
because I'm not Indian.
But I love that. I mean, because I can hear myself talk and that's fine. But like after a while, it gets boring. But like, once in a while you get a coca, like a tweet and I'm like, okay, but those are good. That's what I think that's the best thing.
You're saying that I go on mute for a number of hours every day.
But like, I think it's, to me, it's been really interesting because I want this journal to be something that's for our community. I mean, very early on, we kind of, saw ourselves, I mean, we don't really own this. We're like stewards of it. We're going to be here. I told Michelle at the beginning, right? We're here for 10 years. What can we do? We hopefully will leave it in a better shape than what we got it. I mean, it was in a great shape when we got it, but we don't want to ruin it. I don't think we're going to do that. But that's kind of been our philosophy through this whole process. I do worry very much though about what, your tweet in all seriousness, like kind of just reopened in my own mind. Cause I have to be very honest. I think that article, if it had come to us, we would have found like 100 different reasons to, and you guys know this, right? I mean, like you get an observational study, you can tear it apart, right? I mean, even the best observational study, you can tear it apart. We see it every week on Twitter, right? Every week we see somebody just going to town on some article. And, so, just being cautious and careful about that and kind of understanding that is really tough. My AEs are the best at that. And the lively discussion we have and the pushback is really what I think keeps it very interesting and engaging.
Great. Maybe one last item, peer review, anonymous peer review or open peer review. What's your stance on that?
So we're going to have some changes. So right now it's anonymous peer review. There have actually been studies done of this, right? Randomized trials that have been done to try to see, like, does it change peer review? I think so. The anonymous peer review goes both ways, right? So, and I just want to make sure that there are two aspects. One is, do you make the authors anonymous to the reviewers? And then the other is what we continue to do right now, which is, do we make the reviewers anonymous to the authors? Making the authors anonymous to the reviewers is really hard to do. I think, we've talked about it a bit, but it's just super hard to figure out. And, that can be challenging. There are a couple of journals that do it and they've spent a lot of time and effort, I think, and they do it really well. We've chosen that's probably not a priority of what we can do. We do, we are going to start to experiment, and we're going to allow peer reviewers to reveal themselves to authors, and we're going to see how it goes. There have been a couple of journals that have done this on a voluntary basis, so we're curious. I think it's a great idea because we oftentimes don't get it as much these days, but like, when you have to put your name at the bottom of anything, it just elevates the level of the work, right? I mean, and I think it's fine. I mean, I peer review for the BMJ, and I can tell you, even before I hit click, right, I'm just making sure I haven't misspelled stupid words and going through it and making sure it just makes sense to another level, because your name's going on the bottom and it's going to be open. And the nice and cool thing about what the BMJ does is they not only make it public to the authors, right? They actually publish it, afterwards as part of the final paper product. And a few months ago, one of the issues that was really interesting that came up about that was like realizing that there might be connections between the peer reviewers and then even the author group, which again, just transparency in that whole area just seems to be kind of the right way to go if you can do it. There is concern, obviously, if you're a junior person and you're reviewing the work of somebody who's like a luminary in your field, how critical can you be? So I think what's important for us is as we're experimenting with this, there's going to be certain parts of that review that we want to keep confidential so people can actually be open about saying that. So there will always be that confidential comments to the editors, which we're not going to open up completely.
Yeah, I think it's very important. My position is in favor of making the reviewers known. Just because I know as a fellow, I've been asked by attendings to review papers for them. Right? They were selected reviewers. They didn't have the time or the interest in reviewing papers, and so it fell on me to review the paper. Mm-hmm. And that's really unfair for the scientists, for the people who put all this time and effort to have just the first year fellow, go over the paper.
Yeah.
So I applaud you for moving in that direction.
I wanted to hear about on another front. I was dying to hear your thoughts on the Ischemia trial and how that all unfolded. Did you find? Could you kind of take us through why you felt it was important to publish the Francis and colleagues letter, and then what happened from there?
Yeah. So obviously the Ischemia trial is it's an important trial. It's going to be a trial that we all kind of point towards. It's one of these studies that is whether or not it ends up being positive or negative is going to have a huge influence on our practice. And certainly on kind of the science and discussion around what we do with revascularization. So for that reason, right, I mean, like it's just an important topic for us to discuss. So we get this, paper by Chris Rajkumar and Daryl Francis, and it's quite interesting. And, when we kind of follow up with them and we look at some of the websites that they had, pointed us towards, including the clinicaltrials.gov website where they have to post, their protocols and updates and stuff. As far as we could tell at that point in time, like, what they wrote made sense, right? I mean, that there, had been this shift in this endpoint, but it hadn't been really highlighted very much. And so, so then we were, we went ahead and we had to go through, we evaluated the paper, we decided to publish it, we put it out there. And then almost immediately, right, I mean, like it got both a lot of attention, and then B, some of the Ischemia investigators, Greg Stone, Sripal Bangalore, they raised issues about how, things had changed. And I did learn a lot from that paper. I learned ongoing studies, right? I mean, they change over time, and they change almost like week to week. And, I'm an investigator myself, and I can kind of appreciate that, right? I mean, so I think giving the trialists that were involved at least a chance to comment on the paper prior to it, not to comment on whether we're going to take it or not, because I'm absolutely clear about that. That's our decision. But at least comment about factual issues so we can get the story straight. We should have sent it to Judy Hockman and said, hey, look, we're going to publish this. Do you have any kind of thoughts about this? And is it factually correct? So that's one lesson I learned. I think the other lesson I learned, though, is, and I'm still proud to have published the paper, is, again, getting back to that point about, science evolves over time. And, believe me, there's not one single paper that's going to tell us the truth. And once that's published, the story's done. And even if that paper existed, it's not going to be in CircCQO, okay? And so, we want to just be a part of this discussion. And I've been super proud of the fact that, we were a vibrant part of that discussion. We allowed kind of Judy Hockman and the trialists from Ischemia to kind of respond in our pages as well. And then, since that time too, I think, we've received, a lot of papers that we've been able to kind of consider, I think largely because people saw that, we were willing to kind of publish something that might be, and at the end of the day, I mean, it doesn't diminish the quality of the trial. In fact, it just makes us even more eager to kind of understand what its results are going to be about. I will say that maybe, ischemia could be one of the trials that breaks the model, right? I mean, I've talked about this, right? I mean, like, ischemia is so important, to be honest. If it got published in, like, my supermarket gazette, we'd all be talking about it and citing it. And, I wonder how the investigators are going to release their data, right? I mean, I'm sure there's going to be the New England Journal of Medicine publication of the ischemia trial. That will happen. I guarantee you. But the question is like, what do they do with the other data around it? And Michelle, at the beginning, you were kind of alluding to open science and open data. I mean, it would be wonderful if we could find a model for, like, doing this. The SPRINT trial took us a step further. And I wonder if something like with the ischemia trial, particularly with the energy that's been generated by both our publication and then a recent one by Venk Moorthy, who's a colleague in the American Heart Journal, maybe this will be the trial where they'll start to say, okay, well, we're going to release more of the data. We'll put it online. It'll accompany the publication. And that'll be a good step forward. So
I think that's a great recap. I think it's fascinating to me over the last 6 months. And it kind of started with Orbita. Mm-hmm. How much the covers have been pulled back in terms of the process, in terms of how the sausage is made, when you're talking about publishing and when you're talking about a lot of the back and forth that happens among in academia. So do you think that, so I'm specifically talking in this case about this kind of push and pull between, in this case, the Francis Rajkumar group and the ischemia investigators. Do you think that conversation, it seems to me the conversation is way more public now than it was in the past, right? And I think that's because of social media. Do you think, and I think Daryl Francis is the chief, one of the chief architects of kind of really in a visceral way, kind of going after folks publicly when, they disagree, when they disagree with him on, grounds that he feels are not valid. What do you think about that? Do you think this has coarsened the discussion and it's good for science, or do you think this is coarsened the discussion and it's bad, or do you think this is a good thing and this is only going to we're only going to get more and more of this type of open discussion about what's going on behind the scenes?
I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think I was like, look, I think at the end of the day, I've got a lot of respect for both camps here. I mean, I think, I really respect Daryl and Raj Kumar, so Daryl and Chris did a great job of, like, raising questions, posing them, and, kind of pushing the discussion, because I think, lots of people have written about this. I mean, we don't have a lot of venues. It's surprising, I just started getting active on Twitter like around the time of Orbita, just like many people, because and I've been really entranced by it, largely because of this idea that, you know, if you talk to some of the old timers, they'll talk about like, oh, at the AHA in, you know, 1980 or something, you'd hear like a microphone argument between two luminaries just going back and forth at it, right? I mean, none of that happens anymore, right? I mean, we're maybe overly polite. Maybe we take things too personal. Maybe the attacks oftentimes are ad hominem, you know, which is not very helpful. And so everyone gets afraid of that. And the real discussion and back and forth has been really challenging. So I have a lot of respect for, like, you know, both Daryl and Chris and his group, you know, Rasha, for kind of, you know, really pushing some of these issues and areas. And there's lots of other people that do this too. I mean, you know, the flip side is I have a lot of respect for the ischemia trial investigators, right? I mean, these are the guys that are in the arena, right? I mean, they're trying to do something that's like super hard to do. And let's just be honest. I mean, Judy Hockman is trying to do a trial that nobody even has the business of even imagining, let alone kind of accomplishing. And so it's really hard to do. So I think both of these discussions back and forth are like really important. I think that the goal of a journal here is not to answer it, and it's not to, you know, favor one group or the other, but it's to allow the discussion to happen. And if we can accomplish that in a way that both groups kind of either are equally pissed at us or equally like happy with us, I think we've done a lot of good. But that's kind of how I see our challenge is we're just, you know, using your metaphor a little bit, we're like, you know, there's a playing field here, and we just want to create something that's like a fair system by which ideas can get discussed and debated, and not necessarily try to play, you know, who's going to be the winner or not. Now, we all have our biases. I have my own bias, and I try to keep that as much out of it. But the reality is that's probably gets into the subtle subjectivity of how journals work.
I think it's incredibly fascinating, because I think what you're seeing happen is that you have some fairly major players trying to get out front of data before it's being published. So you have folks that are very interested in ischemia being a negative trial, and you have folks that are super interested in ischemia being a positive trial. And everyone, before it even comes out, is trying to set up the milieu to say, if ischemia is positive, well, it's well, we told you so. It was going to be positive because they changed the endpoints, and that's why it's positive. And if it's negative, you have folks going the other way. Now, Venk Moorthy, a prolific, prodigious guy that I just cannot keep up with. He also wrote something on ischemia, and he actually is one of the first guy on Twitter. I have to give him credit for this. He's the first guy that I was following that really made note of the fact that ischemia had this endpoints that changed slightly, and then kind of went off from there. But Venk also published something, right? Mm-hmm. And then that was withdrawn. Did you follow all that, and did you think there was anything within that was not kosher, or would you have done things differently? Meaning, so just as a brief, Venk published something. It went online first. Again, the ischemia trial investigators or somebody related to the ischemia, whoever was running, one of the PIs or something like that, said, well, I'm not sure about some of the things that are said, and actually was withdrawn while some minor corrections were made, even though the larger thrust of the paper was okay. Did you follow that, or any issues with what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, Venk's a good friend, and he's here at Michigan and stuff. And so, and you're right, he's actually incredible on Twitter. Not only is he prodigious, but he's like always interesting. And he has been, I think, a really, in a lot of ways, again, he's somebody who always shares ideas that are, engaging to people, and I think he's clearly been making a big impact. I think it's I can see both sides of this. Dan Mark is the editor-in-chief of the HJ, and I can tell you it's hard to go on both sides. I mean, I think the big thing is that this trial has lots of people that are obviously interested in it for the very reasons you mentioned, and I do think it's a little bit unfortunate that on both sides of the equation, right? Like I think that we do need to prep ourselves for it when it comes out, because this isn't one of these trials where we're going to pay attention to it and then next week the New England Journal is going to have another issue and we're going to forget about it. So I think the framing of it and what we're expecting from it is really important to have that debate up front. And I think that that's a good thing and encouraging. I think it actually could make a difference, in how the trial is kind of thought of and interpreted at the time when it's first released. There's the trialists have said this a couple of times, and I think it makes sense too. Like, let us finish the trial, right? I mean, David Marin, who's one of the PIs, is just, he said this so many times. He's just like, let us finish this, right? I mean, support us in this thing because we've made a big investment. And I think that's important as well too. It's like most things, right? I mean, people are not like, we look sometimes for like heroes and villains, right? And everything. And I don't think Twitter's any different. And, I think there's probably heroes and villains within each one of us. And sometimes some of them's winning more than another. And I think it's important for us to just keep this balance. I did think like, how would I've handled it? I probably would have been like, I don't want anything near, if I were like at all involved in a study and that study was being raised as a question, that automatically goes to the guest editors at CircCQO. And, sometimes I'll be honest with you, this is how, this is how like strong we've kind of made the firewall. Like, the first time it'll come out is like there'll be a tweet about a paper and I'm like, I didn't even know we published that, right? And then I realized why. And so and Dennis Coe and our guest editorial staff, they're the ones that have handled it. So
I'll make a comment before and I'll stop monopolizing.
No.
But I think you guys have a really, really, really hard job now, because I think there's such a great level of transparency now. Like any PI, any co-PI, any fellow who's involved, who like has some intimate knowledge, can get on using some burner account on Twitter and put out stuff. And I think it's you guys just have an incredibly tough job to curate, do all the things that you've talked about, not let your own biases get in the way, not have links that may even look like it's that there's some type of conflict of interest. So I think you guys have an incredibly tough job, because I think social media has really made things transparent in a way that any missteps or any foibles are just out there for everyone to see. So good luck. I as well have enjoyed your editorials. Good luck, and I'm glad you're one of the good guys fighting the fight.
Can I ask you guys a couple questions?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. Of course. All right, that's allowed? All right.
Yeah, of course.
All right. So we are, we are thinking hard about how to use Twitter for good, right? And Bobby Ye, one of our associate editors, wrote fantastic perspective piece a few months ago about that. Trying to make sure it's like the wisdom of the crowds as much as we can. How do you guys think we could do that? Like, what are there ways we could facilitate discussions better, or we don't want to be the journal that just like tweets out every single article is like, hey, CQO just published so and so, right? Because I don't think that that's going to attract like at Rograd or you guys. So how can we? Have you seen a way to do that, or how can we use social media better?
I think it's tough. It's hard to control that crowd, and it can be wise and it can be very unwise. I think that's the name of the game. I think kudos to you for getting in there. I don't see many other journal editors on Twitter. Jeff Drazen is not, and so you're brave to be on. But it's and the question of social media, is part of a larger sort of societal, situation we find ourselves in, where I think it's going to be hard to rein in the emotions. So I don't know. I'm not very optimistic that you'll find something, very civil, and because people feel strongly, especially healthcare right now. People feel very strongly about a lot of things. As Anish alluded to, I think when the Ischemia trial will come out, there will be two reactions. One with whatever the result is, it'll be either we knew it all along or we don't believe it. Right? Yeah. No matter what the data is, and so I don't know, but I think it's important to continue to talk about it, and the emotions will be high. There will be snafus. There will be people getting blocked and unblocked, and as we've seen in the last few months.
But Brahmaji, do you think so? Is that question implies that you're saying that instead of being you're saying that there needs to be more. Are you saying that what's happening in terms of the discussion on Twitter you find is usually not constructive? Say around ischemia or whatnot.
Yeah, I think that, part of it is, but I think there's a better way. I mean, when is this thing actually going to get posted? I'm kind of curious, because
I think we have flexibility, but it could be in the next couple of days, unless if you wanted to time it, we'd be happy to.
Well, so one of the things we're thinking about is actually trying to bring on commentators. We're actually bringing on a role for a couple of junior people who are active on Twitter to help facilitate these discussions. Because the better example is Orbita. I mean, if you guys remember that, some of the discussion was great, right? But I think Rasha was really smart. She basically was like, you know what, I'm going to let everybody burn this thing, and we'll let the forest burn. And then when it finally goes down to embers, she comes out and she's been very thoughtful and great. And to get mixed in that kind of fire, it just doesn't seem to make sense. Now, but I think there's a way to facilitate that journals can play a more active role, not just reacting. And I've thought about this role more in the sense of like almost having you guys, I think people who kind of follow our journal or comment on it or are interested in the topics, almost as like an ombudsman, who's an outsider who maybe is not involved with our journal practices. Like they don't have, and you can tell, we've thought about this a lot to the point where we're going to go ahead with it. Where what we will do is we will, we'll have these individuals. They didn't necessarily choose the papers that we were going to publish, but they will help us facilitate discussions around those papers to a point where like maybe there's some kind of lasting improvement in knowledge. Because I will tell you this, any paper we have, let's say we have 2 peer reviewers, 3, 4, even 5 peer reviewers, right? The moment you publish it, and if it's interesting enough and it catches people's attention, you suddenly have 100,000 peer reviewers, right? And your paper will get dissected. It will, get discussed. People will look at it in different ways. And we want this to be a good thing and not just an exercise in either just a bunch of churning of the same old. And then at the end of the day, a week later, nobody even remembers what they were talking about. So that's kind of how we want to see this, and maybe even tie that discussion back through links to the original article. So if somebody, can kind of, see that paper and then suddenly see, oh, this was the social media discussion around it, and there's some summary or story that can be tied to it.
Yeah. Whatever it is, you have to make sure you maintain trolling independence.
Yeah.
Right. There has to be troll.
It has to be. Well, I've told the 2 people. That's why I didn't know. So the 2 people, are going to be Bobak Zain, from UCLA, and then Maddie Sterling in New York. And I've told them what I really want is the first time I know that this will have succeeded is when it's like one of my papers on CQO, and they're totally trashing it, and facilitating a discussion around that. I'll be both sad and happy at the same time. But you're right, having the independence to like have, a discussion around it and have it be a real discussion, because man, the moment you try to fake it on Twitter, it's like people call you out so quickly. It could be really tough.
Yeah, it's almost like you need folks that are independent enough from academia to be able to be very free in terms of their comments, right? I mean, because I from the brief conversations I've had with folks in real life and not on Twitter, that happens every now and then.
Yeah.
It seems like folks are really, 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 really nervous. Because it's a relatively small community. I mean, cardiology is a relatively small community of some very, very influential folks.
Yeah.
And if you want to climb the right ladders and get to the right places, you really want to be careful about not having not saying things that upset folks. So I think somehow maintaining independence and having an authentic voice is incredibly important. And I think that's one of the reasons why Michelle and Saurabh are so successful, because it's hard to figure out who's shaping them. It's pretty clear that Michelle is shaped. It's not shaped by anyone. It's pretty clear that Saurabh is shaped by his and his own personal experiences. So I think that's the hard part. I find, unfortunately, there's a lot of very conformist thought in many circles that a lot of times is what kind of dumbs down and deadens the discourse. So I think I don't know how exactly journals can shape that, but that's a nice. I mean, that's one idea, certainly, to have voices that are independent from the journal or from the cardiology community, say, or trying to facilitate discussion on there. The interesting thing about Orbita is that it was kind of crowdsourced, right? There was all these comments that were made that perhaps didn't have much standing. Meaning, we sat there and listened to lots and lots of folks detract Orbita. And then, out of the blue came this whirlwind, the cyclone Hurricane 5 category, Daryl Francis, who kind of cleaned up and swept up and, took people up on this. And was like, if you're going to say this, go ahead and, back it up with something. So,
yeah.
So you almost wonder, as you get more and more folks on, that you get more and more of that, which means that you don't necessarily need one specific journal to facilitate it. That the stuff is going to kind of bubble up from the ground, which should please the very libertarian Michelle, right?
Yeah.
On that note, guys, I'm looking at the clock. You've been very generous, Brahmaji, with your time. It was a wonderful discussion. I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy it. We look forward to what's happening with you, with these last comments that you had about having an online social media commentator, independent troller, and
that's a nice title. I like it.
We spent so much time thinking of the title, but nobody ever came up with CQO troller. I'll get
All right.
All right.
Well, have a great rest of the day and weekend.
All right. Thanks, guys.